Welcome to the Bitcoin Source, your essential podcast for all things Bitcoin. I'm Dawdu, your host for today's thought-provoking session. We're thrilled to have with us Mark Hendrickson, the general manager for Lether, the Bitcoin and Stacks wallet. Mark has had a fascinating journey starting from growing up in Menlo Park, California, to leading product strategy and development at some of the most innovative tech startups. Now based in Barcelona, Spain, Mark is at the forefront of Bitcoin technology and integration with Stacks. Mark, it's a pleasure to have you on. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
So, Mark, let's begin at the origins of your journey growing up in Menlo Park. What experiences first sparked your interest in technology, and were there any early influences that shaped your career path?
Well, growing up in Menlo Park, it's really the heart of Silicon Valley. And so everything around me just lived and breathed technology. I had, family, friends. My whole school was full of kids from like tech entrepreneurs. It was just all tech all the time. So it's hard to pinpoint the exact cause of why I got into tech, but it was just everything, basically. I do remember when I was quite young, like 11, 12, 13, started dabbling very, very early in website design using WYSIWYG editors that were available in the mid 90s, way back when with Netscape and whatnot. And it just all kind of snowballed from there and made a career out of it.
Nice. You've had this unique opportunity to work in several tech startups. What was your first major breakthrough in the tech world, and how did it propel you forward into these roles that you've held today?
Well, my first job out of college, I ran away to the East Coast of the US and came back after graduation. Was for TechCrunch. And so I joined TechCrunch first as an intern, just to help out with data related things, and very quickly started writing for them as a blogger. And so I had a couple of years where I was doing blogging, tech blogging, networking a ton with VCs and entrepreneurs and folks in the industry, while also booting up a project called Crunchbase, which is now an independent company, TechCrunch, serving as basically the product manager and designer of that project. So I would just say my experience at TechCrunch, being my first post-college job, was just incredibly critical for me because even though I was from Silicon Valley, it just supercharged my entry from a professional stance into the scene. And then I went from there and then started my first startup directly after TechCrunch and did the whole game. Started hacking away in my garage, joined an accelerator, then raised VC, launched the blogs, and then scaled from there. So yeah, it all starts I think with TechCrunch, and then my first startup experience right after that.
Yeah, I love to hear it. It always seems like people from your area, growing up in your area, just have this insane entrepreneurial spirit, like when it comes to just technology or just even just tinkering with things. Like, I don't know if there's something in the water in that area, but it's always beautiful to hear how people from Menlo Park or San Francisco always have this like foresight to kind of build and create themselves in the technology forefront. So that's an awesome introduction to who you are as a person, Mark. I appreciate it. So Mark, as we fast forward to your introduction to Bitcoin, what initially drew you to it, and was there any specific moment or realization that shifted your focus into this space?
Yeah, it was fairly gradual as I was developing my career, really in the early 2010s. First with that first startup, and then other ones that I worked on. They were Web 2.0 startups, so they were traditional, centralized companies with centralized databases controlling user identities, user data. And I grew sensitive to that question of how much power we as company owners had over the entire experience that users had with our products. So we could see directly into, of course, their data and who they were, and you could delete them with a stroke of a keyboard. And I evolved towards having a concern around that, a deep concern around the fragility, all of our lives moving online, but being predicated on products that were centralized and could be basically pulled out from beneath us or corrupted in various ways. So I started looking into technologies, not crypto related, not Bitcoin related, that would help with the essentially the distribution or the decentralization of control over user data, user identities. There were a number of open source projects back then that I was interested in. I started my own open source project around data ownership um, sometime around 2013, 2014. And as I was hacking on that and working in that sort of general area, I discovered a company called Blockstack. And Blockstack was really a company, really one of the only companies at the time trying to build a replacement for Web 2.0 using Bitcoin in particular, but crypto in general. And I was very intrigued by the fact that they were aiming for the same ideals that I had at the time, as far as providing technologies that would essentially liberate us from these centralized companies. And so I decided to join them. And when I joined them, as a crypto noob, a real sense of how blockchains worked, the different differences between Bitcoin, Ethereum, and everything else. That was 2018, and ever since then, I've just become deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole when it comes to crypto, and found that the principles underlying Bitcoin in particular just aligned perfectly with what I was trying to build and the sort of world that I was trying to create. Didn't realize at the onset that Bitcoin had that powerful foundation for much more than just monetary use cases. But obviously, now, having worked on it for a number of years, that's something that I'm very much aware of and trying to build towards.
Nice. And it's kind of insane to think learning about Bitcoin, being orange pilled, getting the understanding of the protocol to fast forwarding and just being able to actually make this a career and work in, industries that you never would have thought of would have been possible 5 or 10 years ago. So, as the general manager for Leather, you're now heavily involved in the Bitcoin wallet space. How did your experience at these early stage startups influence your approach to developing this type of product?
Yeah, crypto and Bitcoin in particular, they are by their very nature very technical. And I think when I came into the space in 2018, it was very apparent from the start that a lot of the user experience really failed to to bridge over to non-technical users. And so I think coming from Web 2.0, where we'd already gone through a long history of trying to repackage or reframe technical concepts in a way that were amenable to non-technical users and audiences. There were UX design patterns, if you will, that I learned from that world that I basically decided I wanted to bring to crypto and Bitcoin. And so I think in my work, what I'm trying to do is make Web3 or crypto-based technology in general as accessible as Web 2.0, using the best of Web 2.0, while always being true to the principles of crypto. You don't want to undermine that. That's the most important thing to do, is to preserve those key principles, and also not to paper over too much about what's actually going on. Like, you have to find a balance between um, not putting the technicalities in front of everyone, because lots of people are scared by that stuff and they're confused by that stuff. And yet you want to be transparent. You want to be clear and honest about what's going on. You can't reduce the user experience to something that doesn't actually represent what's going on. So that's sort of the challenge, and I think the general skill that I bring to the plate for it.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit more about Leather and its role in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So, of course, there's tons of wallets out there. We're kind of like inundated with Bitcoin wallets at this point. What innovations do you believe are essential for Bitcoin wallets to stay ahead, and what sets Leather apart in an ever-evolving market?
Yeah, well, I think it has to do with our origin in many ways. So we started off as the first wallet for the Stacks ecosystem, the Stacks network, which is really designed to be an L2 for Bitcoin. And the underlying belief there, which drives the core protocol development of Stacks, but also our development on the wallet side, is that there's only so much you can do on Bitcoin as an L1 functionally for applications. And you're going to have an L2 or L2s to power the breadth of things people need to do when it comes to replacing Web 2.0, replacing our traditional financial system. And so our focus on creating the best wallet for not just L1, but for an L2 like Stacks, and bridging the experience between those two things, that's really where we focus. Because we believe that if we were just focused on the L1 side, that was our main focus. There's a limited number of things that I think you can really do there. And so we're looking to empower not just users, but app builders by creating an experience that bridges those two worlds. And it really creates a comprehensive development environment and user experience when it comes to both the L1 and L2.
Yeah, and that just reminds me of a former guest I had on, John Light, and he's really big into the layer two solutions, creating bridges that can be built on top of the protocol from the layer one side. And it always makes me curious to think like, how did you first get involved with stacks? Was it just based off of efficiency and speed? Because we know layer one is kind of slower and more mundane. And we also have tried and true Bitcoiners that do not like people tinkering with layer one. Was that like the case for you, Mark?
Yeah, well, going back to Blockstack, which I joined in 2018, it was started by folks that had tried in the early days to build directly on Bitcoin, realized it was too limited, just couldn't do enough with it as an L1, and so decided to work on an L2. Back then, I don't think we even use that language. These days, L2s for Bitcoin, everyone knows what that is. If you go back to 2018, that wasn't even a category, right? But essentially, that's what they were working on. And it wasn't so much the speed or the cost, although those are super important. It was more the functionality. And so we had Ethereum, of course, to look at. And the big thing with Ethereum that Bitcoin didn't have was smart contracts, so programmability. So that was really the focus for the first few years of working at Blockstack and also building a wallet for stacks. But I think as we're seeing stacks evolve, it's interesting. We're seeing there's a couple of big upgrades going on to stacks this year. One called Nakamoto, which is being rolled out right now. That's going to bring speed to stacks and basically get us away from the Bitcoin block time to something that's just a matter of seconds. And so as an L2, I think speed is now a competitive benefit that it provides. And it's a lot less costly. I mean, it has been a lot less costly compared to Bitcoin since it was launched. I would say the functionality is the key thing, bringing smart contracts to Bitcoin, essentially. That's number one. Bringing speed and cost benefits, I think, are in some ways secondary, but super important second.
And I mentioned before in this episode that where you grew up and just being in those early stages of your tech career in Menlo Park in San Francisco, I always think that change of environment is super important. And you're now living in Barcelona. How has these varied settings shaped your approach to technology and your view of Bitcoin? Is it different in Europe compared to being in America?
Good question. It's interesting. I moved to Spain more for personal reasons than professional reasons because I wanted to keep working in tech, but I didn't want it to be everything that I lived and breathed. I didn't want to leave my office and just have dinner with people in tech. And so I think in some ways it's given me a buffer in my personal life from tech and given me a certain amount of perspective around it. I think perhaps the main influence it's had on me personally, which maybe you could say that's sort of a European thing, I think, is the time scale is different. I think when you're in San Francisco, there's such a hyper focus on speed and being first to market and just being there running as relentlessly as possible above all else. It's a very short-term focused culture, I'd say, in many ways. Yes, people are thinking big, but there's this time premium to it that I think is relentless, and I think actually counterproductive when it comes to certain sorts of technologies. I think while in crypto we have degens and we have short-term cycles, and everyone's excited about what's going to happen within the next 24 hours. It's also very much a long-term industry that has to develop. I would say broadly, living in Europe has given me a certain cultural patience to say, this is an industry I want to work in for the very, very long term. It's going to require people to be in this industry thinking 5, 10, 15 years down the line and not too wrapped up in the very, very short term. You can see sort of some of that up as it sort of maybe chilled me out a little bit and given me just a broader view from a time perspective on the work we have to get done.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that as well, Mark. I was recently in Madrid in April of this year, and I could say firsthand that it's definitely a different pace of lifestyle. People aren't, I don't want to say as driven, but they're not letting work fully consume their individuality of who they are like Americans do. And they take times to go to lunch and have dinners and enjoy walks in the park. Like we don't embrace that as much in America. And I think that technology has only sped that up even more, where people have become like chronic workaholics. And I think the ethos of Bitcoin and crypto in the early stages is like building fast, building hard, trying to get things to market, like you said, and kind of being the innovator in the space to say, hey, we created this layer two solution first. and now everyone else is going to kind of play off of that. And I
Yeah.
think that you being in Europe kind of really helps you take a step back and actually be more of a critical thinker because you're not being stressed out by the ins and outs of just being in the tech space. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It's curious because it's a bit of a synthesis, I think, at least on my part. And I think I've seen this in other entrepreneurs that have moved from the US to Europe. You maybe have this fear. What you don't want to do is you don't want to fall into just apathy and think, just, be on the
Yeah.
beach all day, right? Because there's that stereotype as well. You want to reconcile, you recognize that a lot of what's happening in the US, of course, drives innovation, but there's a frenetic pace to it that I think has its costs. Resolve that part of it and yet stay committed to actually making important change over the long term. So that's what I seek to do.
Yep. There's been this increasing interest in Bitcoin ordinals. Given your expertise, how do you see ordinals playing a role in Bitcoin's future? And are there something that Leather is doing or exploring in the ordinals market that you want to talk about?
Yeah. Well, so when Ordinals blew up, start of the last year, so a year and a half ago, it was really important for us to support Ordinals, and we were there doing so as far as the ability to manage them, send, receive them, trade them, all that functionality we put in place last year because despite our focus on the L2 side, we do believe the L1 piece is critical. We're not exclusively focused on just the L2 to the expense of the L1. However, I do think that was an initial phase, if you will, of our investment in ordinals and other L1 based protocols like stamps and other things, because you need to have good L1 support, but you need then, again, with this thesis of you can only do so much on the L1, you need to bring ordinals and other L1 sets over to the L2. And you need to make them programmable. And so I would say that unless we can figure out the way to essentially bridge ordinals assets to stacks, use them in smart contracts, and then bridge them back to the L1 as needed, the user proposition is still quite limited. And so our investment these days is very much in this question: how do you create an experience where you can create on either side, either on one side or the L2 side, and decide to move to the opposing side based on your needs. So if you start on the L2 side because you want to create something and trade it quickly and cheaply, but then you want to later move it to that one side because you want that persistence, you want that reliability of being on Bitcoin. We want to facilitate that, make that really easy. Or conversely, if you start off on the L1 side, because by default, these days, ordinals are just on L1. If you want to bring a collection over the stack side, facilitate its trading, its programmability. There's this whole space, I think, once you get ordinals into smart contracts that we just haven't explored yet. There's just so much stuff that you could do with those assets that I think is just like a greenfield opportunity. So that's the sort of thing we want going forward, and make it really make ordinals, bring ordinals to layers. Basically, I think that's the the second chapter, if you will, of ordinals that we were interested in.
Yeah, and ordinals have been having this monstrous takeover for like 6 to 8 months in the space. I personally think that a lot of people are really concerned about the price right now. Like the price is kind of fluctuating lower than people would expect for the halving that just passed. But like you said, Mark, I think that the ordinal space has a lot of potential that we have not untapped yet. And of course, reflecting on all the different startups that you've been in, whether it was Lyft or Leather or some of these other places, I think people such as yourself are going to bring a different perspective to that market that we haven't seen in the past because there's so much like pushback from the L1 community or the original engineers of Bitcoin. They're not like huge fans of ordinals. But I think we're now seeing a new influx of like new blood, different kind of perspectives from the tech space into that area. So I'm excited to see what you're going to continue to build.
Thanks, I appreciate that. And I know it's true culturally. There has been a certain resistance to ordinals on the L1 side, but ordinals are surviving and thriving there despite that. On the L2 side, it's ordinals. I think they're welcomed with open arms, and so I think that's great to see culturally. Folks working on stocks, but other L2s on Bitcoin. You have a ton of people that are also looking to innovate. So I'm very hopeful about them.
For sure. Mark, what's been the most valuable lesson you've learned in product development and how have you applied that to your work at Leather?
Most valuable lesson. To speak very generally, I think there is a successful product development is the intersection of the art and science of both crafting a compelling vision based on your intuition and your pre-established experiences in the world. There's sort of the internal creative engine to it that's super vital. But you need to complement that and pair that very strongly with validation model and empirical way of testing, whether it's qualitatively or quantitatively. And so the most important, I guess, general lesson I've learned, I learned over and over again, is constantly trying to you constantly be crafting or working harder and better at that vision setting, but also the validation process that you have in place and complementing those two things. That pyramid, if you will, the sort of yin and yang is what drives success. There's lots of ways in which to get done, but I think when I found myself on projects that weren't going as well as you'd hope, it's because I was over indexed on one versus the other. It's like having one muscle that I fix compared to the other. There's too much vision testing. Well, there's just too much testing and trying to figure out what the market is just telling you, but without any sort of principles, right? And so it's cooperating towards the center or the sort of the junction of that, which is I think the critical thing.
Yeah, so was it kind of like a looking at things with the glass half full type of ideology? Like, I'm curious because there's so many people in product development, like there's so many products that are going to be at the forefront in the crypto Bitcoin space, and I'm always curious to hear, expertise on this, and I definitely don't know as much about product development as you do, Mark. So just to add on to that question, like, is it a glass half full kind of mentality when you're kind of building out a product or visioning that aspect?
As far as being optimistic
Yep.
versus glass, yeah, I mean it's curious. It's you definitely have to be optimistic and you have to be faithful to some extent. I mean, we'll have certain moments, right? You can't be looking to wake up tomorrow and know for sure that what you're looking on is going to be successful long term. And yet, it's balancing that optimism that you have, that faith, with very rigorous testing and questioning. I suppose it's like the cliche expression. It's good to have strong beliefs but loosely held. That's more important in this work than perhaps others. You need to be you need to be very invested in those strong beliefs and crafting them and being very intentful about them on a moment's notice, question them based on the information that you're hearing from the world. So yes, on balance, you have to be optimistic. I mean, if you're pessimistic at this job, you'll find a million reasons why certain things won't work.
Yeah.
But it's an art and a science.
Yes. And last question for you, Mark. So, looking towards the future, where do you see Bitcoin wallets evolving, and what's your vision for Leather's place in that future?
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to what I was saying about the question of bridging to layers. I do think the future for Bitcoin in general and Bitcoin, not just as the basis of a financial system, which I think it is the most important thing that Bitcoin promises, is revolutionizing finance, but also the basis of a new internet and structuring how we use applications, how we access them, how do we own them together. That's going to rely on layers. I think there will be a certain amount of evolution when it comes to the L1. L1 is not completely static, of course, but I think that the underlying value of Bitcoin is that it doesn't move too fast as an L1. It's conservative. And I think you need other layers, other L2s like stacks, moving at a faster clip, experimenting more, and basically extending the functionality of Bitcoin. And I think Bitcoin wallets need to essentially embrace that and build towards that for users and developers alike. So that's certainly my mission. I think we'll likely see other wallet companies wake up to that reality as they see persistent I'd say maybe stalling of use cases on the L1 solely. And I think I think products that just stick to that L1 and nothing else, I think they'll just find themselves in sort of a perpetual recycling of speculative influxes, but then things will die off. I think the sustainable use cases are going to be powered by L2s.
Yeah, and just to add to the context of that, and I'm curious. So, of course, we're seeing like a newer generation of people coming into the space, whether it's Gen Zers and I just think that they have lived in a world where they've never known anything outside of the internet or a mobile phone. Do you think that that's going to play a role in the future of wallets as well? Where I think like I'm a millennial, for example, and I think that we grew up in a world where we didn't always have technology as much, and we were like adopting it as we grew up. I think that we take the approach to wallets differently than someone that's 17 years old will. Does Leather kind of think about that process and about the future generations that would be using the product?
Yeah, for sure. And I think you're right. I mean, every generation has a different relationship with technology. And so our big initiative right now, for example, is launching a mobile version of Leather. And we're very much actively discussing these questions around the paradigms people bring to the plate based on other applications they've used, their relationship with money, and how that changes over the generations. As you're mentioning for yourself, it's like you come from a certain generation, and you got to then connect with people from the outside your own generation to try to figure out what are the key differences and think about things. And so that's definitely part of our process and something we want to do.
Nice. Mark, this has been an enlightening conversation. Thank you for sharing your journey and insights with us today. We're excited to see what's next for you and Leather as you continue shaping the future of Bitcoin.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Most definitely. And to our listeners, thank you for tuning into the Bitcoin Source. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes where we dive deep into the world of Bitcoin. Until next time, keep stacking those Satoshis.